Porto Alegre Airport, July 17, 2007. A passenger airliner, the Airbus A320 from the airline TAM Express, prepares for a domestic flight 3054 en route from Porto Alegre to São Paulo, Brazil. Boarding the aircraft are 187 people, 181 passengers, and 6 crew members. Piloting the A320 is a highly experienced crew. The 50-year-old captain, Henrique Stefani de Saku, an experienced pilot with over 30 years of flying experience and 13,600 flight hours, and the first officer, Kleber Aguilar Lima, who is also a captain and has logged 14,000 hours. There were also 4 flight attendants on the plane. It's worth noting that it was not uncommon for captains to be present in the cockpit at TAM, as the airline did not strictly control the ratio of senior and junior crew members. At 17:19 local time, the crew receives clearance for takeoff, and the Airbus A320 departs from Porto Alegre, heading towards São Paulo. Shortly after departure, the pilots begin sharing concerns about the upcoming landing at Congonhas. Initially, their aircraft has been operating for 6 days with one inoperative thrust reverser. Thrust reversers help slow down the plane during landing by redirecting engine thrust forward, though they contribute less than 10% of braking power under normal conditions. Therefore, flying with one inoperative reverser isn't really considered dangerous. In this case, a mechanic disabled the right thrust reverser due to a hydraulic leak, leaving only the left reverser functional until the airline could obtain the parts needed for repair. This, however, wasn't the only cause for concern, since for the past 2 days, there have been heavy rains at Congonhas, continuing up until that specific day, resulting in the main runway becoming very slippery. Though since January 2007, the airport would close the runway whenever pilots started reporting poor braking conditions, reopening it only after it's completely dry and safe to land on. The previous day, the airport had to close after a twin-engine aircraft, an ATR-42 of Pantanal Airlines, slid off the runway and crashed onto the grass. Fortunately, no one was injured, but due to heavy damage, the plane couldn't be repaired. Tensions were building up in the cockpit since the pilots knew they'll be landing on a slippery runway at night and in wet conditions with an inoperative thrust reverser and landing weight close to the airport's maximum allowed limit. At 6:43 p.m., the crew begins their descent towards the airport in the evening through visibly thick clouds. For Captain Henrique de Saku, landing remains the primary concern, so he eventually decides to make a slight deviation from the standard landing procedure. According to the established procedures, landing with one inoperative thrust reverser is performed exactly the same as with both reversers. Even if one reverser won't activate, pilots simply move the throttle levers to idle and then shift both levers into reverse thrust. However, using this procedure requires adding an extra 55 meters to the calculations of the landing distance. The problem that occurs here is that when the A320's throttle levers are switched from idle to reverse, the thrust from the engines briefly increases before being directed forward by the reverser system to slow down the aircraft. Furthermore, activating reverse thrust on an engine with an inoperative reverser temporarily increases forward thrust on that engine, as it can't redirect the thrust backward. However, the safety system quickly intervenes to correct this. Although this only lasts a fraction of a second, this increase in thrust adds several dozen meters to the stopping distance. Captain Henrique de Saku, who's already worried about the risk of landing on a short, slippery runway at Congonhas with only one reverser, believes that his margin for error will be better if he uses the old procedure that was used before 2007. In this particular procedure, the pilot moves both throttle levers to idle, then only shifts the lever for the engine with a working reverser into reverse thrust. This avoids a brief forward thrust on the other engine and shortens the braking distance. Although using the old procedure was considered a violation of the rules, Captain Henrique decided it was worth the risk given the catastrophic consequences of overrunning the runway, even by a mere 55 meters. While the aircraft was steadily approaching the airport, the pilots, who were heavily focused on the landing system instruments, finally spotted the runway lights after breaking through the thick clouds. Now comes the hardest part. The first officer contacts the airport tower and confirms that the runway is wet and slippery, just as the pilots feared. While First Officer Aguilar Lima calls out speeds and altitude. The plane continues descending, reaching a very crucial altitude of 30 meters. The engines are set to climb mode to support flight at low speeds, with high drag in landing procedures. But, just as the plane is about to touch down, a retard alert sounds, prompting the pilots to reduce the thrust to idle. At this point, Captain Disaku reaches out to reduce the thrust, as he usually does at this particular stage of the flight. He grabs the left throttle lever and moves it to idle. The wheels strike the runway with a jolt, and he pulls the throttle lever even further back into reverse. The left reverser activates as he expected, but he had no idea that he had just committed a catastrophic error. The right throttle lever was still in climb mode, meaning the right engine continued producing thrust. With the right engine still generating thrust, stopping the aircraft on the runway was simply impossible at this point. The spoilers, or air brakes, which normally deploy automatically on touchdown to reduce lift and help slow down the plane, did not activate because both throttle levers needed to be in idle for this to happen. Consequently, the automatic brakes, which follow the deployment of the spoilers, also did not activate. Without the spoilers, braking efficiency was reduced by 60%, even without considering the additional thrust from the right engine. Even with maximum manual braking, the aircraft would need about 3 times the available distance to stop. While the end of the runway was rapidly approaching, the plane swayed from side to side as the pilots fought against asymmetric thrust, pushing them leftward. The pilots tried their best to correct the situation, but unfortunately, it was way too late. At approximately 18:54 p.m., at a speed of 170 kilometers per hour, the Airbus A320 went off the rain-slicked runway, crossed the highway bordering the airport, and crashed into a building on the other side. The plane struck a hangar containing cargo and a small fuel reserve for TAM Express, and then collided with the building belonging to the same airline, causing several powerful explosions and sparking a massive fire. The aircraft was completely destroyed in the crash and burned up. In the tragedy, 199 people lost their lives, all 187 on board and 12 on the ground. Another 13 people on the ground sustained various injuries. The investigation into the cause of Flight 3054's crash was conducted by Brazil's National Aviation Accident and Investigation Committee. Both black boxes were recovered from the crash site, revealing that 2 seconds before touching down on the runway, both throttle levers were in climb mode. The retard alert had sounded multiple times, recommending that the pilots reduce engine thrust by moving the throttle to idle or engaging reverse thrust. Eventually, the pilots only engaged the left engine reverser, while the right one was deactivated, which was insufficient for adequate braking on the wet runway. Due to the asymmetric engine thrust, combined with slippery conditions, all this led to the crew's loss of control, causing the plane to overrun the runway. The Commission, however, could not pinpoint a single cause or person responsible in the final report, as both technical faults and pilot error could have contributed to the tragedy. Following the catastrophe, the President of Brazil, Lula da Silva, declared 3 days of national mourning. On July 17, 2012, the 5th anniversary of the accident, a memorial square was opened at the site of the tragedy. In 2011, Brazil's federal ministry pressed criminal charges against TAM's Vice President of Operations and 2 other employees, accusing them of negligence in air transport safety, having allowed the plane to land in heavy rain and on a short runway. The trial began in São Paulo in 2013, but the charges were dropped a year later due to insufficient evidence. In 2014, however, the airline's insurer filed a lawsuit against Airbus for $156 million, but lawyers for Airbus argued in a Brazilian court that Airbus bore no responsibility, instead blaming the crash on the crew, airline, and poor runway conditions. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed the video. And as always, until next time.